I never expected a reality show to change everything. When our agency told us we'd be doing one, I thought it was just another chance to boost our popularity and give the fans a behind-the-scenes look at our lives. Infinite Vibes had always been one of the most successful K-pop groups in the industry, and while the pressure from the fans and our agency was always there, this felt like just another promotional stunt, something we would easily manage. But when I walked onto the set and heard the instructions, I felt an uncomfortable twist in my stomach. The challenge was simple, they said. Spend more time with the people closest to you. Your bandmates, your fans, people who have been there with you on this journey. The goal was to make the relationships between us more authentic, more real. But for me and for us, my fellow members, it wasn't going to be that easy. And it was certainly not going to be that easy with Miho. Miho and I had always been close. He was my best friend in the group, the person I turned to for advice when I didn't know how to handle the overwhelming expectations of being a public figure. He had this calm demeanor that could settle my anxious thoughts, and he knew exactly when to joke around to make me laugh. But that was the thing, he was just my friend. Nothing more. The lines between friendship and something else were clear to me, even though we both knew we had a bond stronger than the others in the group. We were partners in a way, always paired together for dances and vocal harmonies. The chemistry between us palpable in every performance. When the producers told us that the show's final twist would involve spending more intimate, personal time with each other, those closest to us, I wasn't sure how to feel. They said the fans loved seeing the real side of us. And what better way to show that than having us reveal our deepest thoughts, struggles, and even fears? The last thing I expected was to feel anything other than awkward with Miho. But everything changed that first night. We were told we would start the next phase of the show by having a deep conversation one-on-one with a member of the group. As usual, I was paired with Miho, and we were given a prompt: talk about your childhood. Something that made you who you are today. I could feel the tension in the air when we were led into a room with just 2 chairs, a spotlight dimly illuminating the space between us. I sat down, trying to laugh it off, trying to tell myself that I was just nervous about the cameras. Miho sat across from me, his face unreadable, his eyes focused on mine. I noticed how his posture was different than usual, his shoulders a little straighter, his eyes a little more intense. "Jay," he said softly, his voice unexpectedly serious. "I never really asked you about your past. What was it like growing up for you?" His words made something inside of me shift. Growing up wasn't exactly a topic I liked to revisit, especially with someone as close to me as Miho. My childhood was filled with small victories and quiet heartbreaks, but I wasn't sure I wanted to open up to him like this. Still, something in the challenge made me want to push myself. We were here to share, to be vulnerable. I took a deep breath, forcing a smile. It was fine, I guess. I spent a lot of time alone. My parents were always working, so I had to figure things out on my own. I tried to sound lighthearted, but the truth was, I didn't know how much I wanted to share. Miho nodded slowly, listening, and for some reason, his gaze felt heavier than it normally did. He didn't interrupt, just waited for me to say more. If I was willing. I guess I didn't really have friends growing up. I was always the quiet kid, focused on my studies. So, I didn't really learn how to be open with people. I felt my throat tighten, and I paused, unsure whether I should go any further. I could see Miho's eyes soften, his lips pulling into a small, empathetic smile. "I never would have guessed," Miho said quietly. "You always seem so confident, like you have everything under control." I shrugged, trying to push the topic away. "I fake it well, I guess." Miho shifted in his seat, and for a brief moment, our eyes locked. The silence stretched between us, and it felt different than any silence I'd ever shared with him before. Something unspoken lingered in the air, something I wasn't ready to acknowledge. Miho seemed to sense it too, and the tension between us thickened, a palpable thing that I couldn't shake. He leaned forward slightly, and for a second, I thought he was going to say something, but he didn't. Instead, he simply nodded and smiled. "I get that, but we're all here for you, right? You don't have to do this alone anymore." His words should have comforted me, but instead, they only made me feel more unsettled. Something about the way he said it felt too intimate, like he knew more about me than I wanted him to. The warmth in his eyes was something I couldn't ignore, even though I tried to pretend it wasn't there. I forced myself to look away. The conversation ended abruptly when the producers called for us to move on to the next challenge. I could feel the heat of Miho's gaze still lingering on me, and when we stood up, I quickly walked ahead, eager to escape the suffocating atmosphere between us. That night, we had a group dinner in the same building, but I couldn't concentrate. I kept thinking about that brief moment of connection with Miho, the way his gaze had softened when I spoke about my childhood, how his hand had lingered on my shoulder for just a second too long. I tried to laugh it off, to tell myself it was just the pressure of the show, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. After dinner, the band went back to our rooms, and I was relieved to finally have some space to breathe. I thought maybe it was just the exhaustion of the day. Maybe I was reading too much into it. But then I heard a knock on my door. It was Miho. I opened it, half expecting him to make some joke about the day's activities. But when I saw his face, I knew this was different. He wasn't smiling. "Can I talk to you for a minute?" His voice was low, almost hesitant. I stepped aside, letting him into the room. "Of course. What's up?" Miho closed the door behind him, and for a long moment, neither of us said anything. He just stood there, looking at me as if he were deciding whether or not to speak. He stopped himself, his eyes darting away for a moment, and I could see him visibly trying to gather his thoughts. "I feel like something's changed between us today. Maybe it's just me, but I think I need to talk to you about it." I felt my heart race. "What do you mean?" Miho looked at me again, and for a split second, I thought I saw something flicker in his eyes, something I couldn't quite place. Then, before I could react, he took a step closer, closing the gap between us. His presence felt overwhelming, too close for comfort. I could feel his warmth, smell the faint scent of his cologne. My body tensed as he reached up, placing a hand gently on my shoulder. "Jay, I don't know what's happening with me, but I can't pretend anymore." Before he could finish, the door to my room suddenly opened, and one of the other band members walked in, breaking the moment. Miho quickly stepped back, and the tension between us snapped like a tight wire. I could feel the heat of the encounter lingering, the words unspoken hanging in the air. Miho didn't say anything else. He just nodded, his face unreadable, and walked out of the room without another word. I stood there, my mind spinning, wondering what had just happened, and what would happen next. The days after that conversation with Miho felt like walking through a haze. I couldn't shake the feeling that something between us had irrevocably changed, but I couldn't figure out what it meant. The whole situation was messing with my head. I had spent the last few years of my life dedicating myself to this group, to our fans, and to the persona I had built up in front of everyone. I had always prided myself on being able to separate my personal life from my career. But now, with every glance Miho gave me, with every touch, every word, I felt like that balance was slowly crumbling. I told myself it was just the pressure of the reality show, that I was imagining things. Miho was my best friend, nothing more. That was the reality. Nothing would change that, no matter how confusing or intimate things felt between us now. But the way his presence affected me, the way my heart seemed to flutter when I caught him looking at me, told me otherwise. It was like my body was betraying me, and the more I tried to ignore it, the more undeniable it became. The reality show continued, and we all slipped into our roles for the cameras. There were moments when everything felt normal, like before, when it was just us, the group, united and focused. We went through rehearsals, performances, and interviews, each task just another thing to get through. But then there were moments when Miho would look at me, his eyes holding onto mine just a fraction longer than usual, and I'd feel my stomach twist. He'd brush up against me in rehearsals, his hand lingering on mine for a beat longer than necessary. Each time, I had to swallow down the rising panic and remind myself that I couldn't let anything change. But it was all a lie. The moment I saw Miho that day after dinner, something inside me shifted, and I couldn't undo it. I tried to brush it off, thinking maybe he was just confused, that maybe it was nothing. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. The tension between us was thick, like a cloud that hovered over every conversation, every interaction. One afternoon, when the group was given a few hours off, Miho found me alone in the practice room. I had gone there to clear my head, to try and make sense of everything that was happening. It had been a grueling day of filming, and I needed some time away from the cameras, away from everyone. I didn't hear him come in, but I felt his presence the moment he stepped through the door. "Hey," he said softly, and I turned to face him. His voice was quieter than usual, and it sent a strange chill down my spine. "Hey," I replied, trying to sound casual. I shifted uncomfortably, unsure of how to act around him now. The space between us seemed charged, and no matter how hard I tried to ignore it, it was there. Miho stood by the door for a few moments, like he was hesitating, before finally walking toward me. He didn't sit down immediately, just stood there, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. "You've been avoiding me," he said, and the directness of it took me by surprise. I stiffened. "I haven't. I've just been busy, that's all." Miho's gaze softened, but there was something in his eyes that made my heart race. "Is that really it, though? You've been acting distant ever since the other night." I felt a pang of guilt twist inside of me. It wasn't as if I wanted to pull away from him, but I didn't know how to handle what was happening between us. "I'm not avoiding you," I said, though I wasn't sure I believed it. "I've just been thinking about everything." "About what?" Miho stepped closer, and I felt my breath catch. The space between us had closed to nothing. "About the show," I said quickly, my mind scrambling for an explanation. "About how weird it all is. The challenges, the everything." I waved my hand in a vague gesture, hoping it would distract him from what I was really feeling. Miho's eyes never left mine. He took another step closer, and his voice dropped to a whisper. "It's not just the show, is it?" The question hung in the air like a bomb about to explode. I wanted to deny it, to brush it off, but the words caught in my throat. How could I explain to him that everything I thought I knew about myself was unraveling? How could I admit that what was happening between us felt like something more than just a fleeting moment? "I don't know what you're talking about," I said, but even I could hear the uncertainty in my own voice. Miho stepped closer again, his body nearly touching mine. I could feel the heat radiating off of him, could smell the faint scent of his cologne, and it sent an electric jolt through me. I couldn't look away from him, and that's when I realized I didn't want to. "You don't have to hide it," Miho whispered, his breath warm against my ear. "I know what I feel. I just don't know if you do." My heart pounded in my chest. He was too close in a way that was impossible to ignore. I should have pushed him away, should have told him to stop. But instead, I stood frozen, my body betraying me once more. I started, but the words stuck in my throat. Miho's hand reached up, brushing a strand of hair from my face, and the touch was so gentle that it sent shivers down my spine. His fingers lingered on my skin, tracing the curve of my jaw before gently cupping my face. My breath hitched in my chest as I looked up at him. "Jay," he whispered, and there was something in his voice that made my heart ache. "I'm not going to pretend anymore. I can't. I want you." The words hit me like a physical blow. My mind went blank, and for a moment, all I could hear was the pounding of my own heartbeat. He was confessing it. He was saying the thing I had been trying to avoid, the thing that terrified me more than anything else. I can't," I stammered, stepping back, my mind racing to find some excuse, some way to pull away from him before it went too far. But Miho didn't let me go. He took a step forward, closing the distance between us. "Why not?" His voice was softer now, almost pleading. "What are you so afraid of, Jay?" I didn't know how to answer him. I was afraid of everything. Afraid of losing him. Afraid of what this meant for both of us. Afraid of what it would do to the group, to our fans, to our careers. I had always prided myself on being the one who could hold everything together, the one who didn't let anything distract me from what was important. But now, with Miho standing in front of me, so close, his presence overwhelming, I couldn't focus on anything but him. I tried to speak, but my throat was dry. I could barely breathe, let alone form words. Miho's fingers moved to the back of my neck, and he pulled me gently toward him, his lips hovering just above mine. The tension between us was unbearable, and I knew I couldn't back away this time. "I don't want to pretend anymore," Miho murmured, his voice low, almost a whisper. "I want this. I want you." And before I could say another word, before I could even think about what was happening, Miho kissed me. It was gentle at first, his lips brushing against mine in a way that felt almost tender, but it quickly deepened, his hands pulling me closer, his body pressing against mine. I didn't resist, couldn't. Everything I had been holding back came rushing to the surface, and in that moment, I let myself feel it all, the heat, the desire, the confusion, the fear. It was all tangled together, but it didn't matter, because for the first time in days it felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. But as Miho pulled away, his eyes searching mine, I knew things had changed between us forever, and now I was forced to face the consequences of what we had just shared. The question remained, could I keep pretending like everything was normal? Or had we crossed a line we couldn't uncross? The moment Miho kissed me, everything I had tried to suppress came rushing to the surface, flooding my mind in a chaotic wave of emotions. His lips were soft, but the pressure of his kiss was firm, pulling me closer, making me forget everything but the heat between us. I knew I should pull away. I knew I should stop it before it went too far, but I couldn't. I didn't. For a fleeting second, it felt right. For that brief moment, I allowed myself to feel something more, something I had never considered between us. But as quickly as the moment came, it disappeared, leaving behind the weight of a decision that I wasn't ready to face. Miho pulled back first, his eyes searching mine with an intensity that sent a shiver down my spine. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, each beat reverberating in my ears, a constant reminder that everything had changed. "Jay?" Miho whispered, his voice thick with uncertainty. I couldn't find the words to respond. I just stood there, frozen, my mind reeling, trying to make sense of what had just happened. How had we gone from best friends, teammates, to something more? And more importantly, what did this mean for us? Asterisk for me, asterisk. "Miho?" I finally found my voice, but it came out shaky, unsure. We can't do this." His face fell slightly, his expression a mix of confusion and disappointment. "Why not?" he asked, his hand still resting on the back of my neck, as if afraid that if he let go, the moment would disappear. I pulled away from his touch, taking a step back to put some distance between us. My mentoralset. What was happening? Why did it feel like the world had just tilted on its axis? "We can't," I repeated, shaking my head. "We're in a group, Miho. We can't risk everything for this." My voice wavered as I spoke, but I tried to sound firm, to convince both him and myself that this was the right thing to do. Miho stared at me, his brow furrowed in frustration. "What are you afraid of, Jay?" he asked, his voice softer now, more vulnerable. "We've been through so much together. Do you think I would let anything come between us? Between the group?" His words hit me like a punch in the gut. I could see the hurt in his eyes, the desperation, and I felt it too. The need to be close to him, to allow myself to feel the connection that had always been there, even if it terrified me. But I was too scared to admit it. "I don't know what I'm afraid of," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "But I know we can't cross this line. It's too risky." Miho's face softened, but there was a sad understanding in his eyes. "You're afraid of losing everything, aren't you? You're afraid of losing the group, the fans, the career we've built. But Jay, I'm not asking you to throw all of that away. I'm asking you to be honest with me." I swallowed hard, the weight of his words pressing down on me. My thoughts were a whirlwind, but the truth was clear. This was more than just about the group. It was about us, and I wasn't sure I was ready to face that. "You know how much the group means to me," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "And I know how much it means to you. This, whatever this is, it could destroy everything. It's not worth the risk." Miho stood still for a long moment, as if he were processing everything I had said. I could see the conflict in his eyes, But there was also something else. Something deeper, something raw. "I don't know what's going to happen, Jay," he said finally, his voice quiet but determined. "But I do know this. I can't go back to pretending like nothing's changed between us. You can't either." His words hung in the air, the weight of them sinking into my chest. He was right, of course. I couldn't go back to how things were before. Things were different now, and pretending otherwise wouldn't change that. I wanted to argue, to insist that nothing had to change, that we could go back to being friends. But deep down, I knew that was a lie. The moment we crossed that line, everything had shifted, and now we had to face the consequences. "We need to think this through," I said, my voice firm despite the turmoil inside. "We can't just rush into something we might regret." Miho nodded, but there was a sadness in his eyes that I couldn't ignore. He didn't want to let go of what we had, and neither did I. But I knew it wasn't just about us anymore. It was about the bigger picture, the group, the fans, the image we had carefully crafted. And I wasn't sure I was ready to risk all of that for something I wasn't even sure of. "I'll give you time," Miho said quietly, taking a step back. "But don't take too long, Jay. We both know this is something we can't pretend isn't happening." He left the room, and I stood there, staring at the door long after he was gone. The weight of everything hung over me, a suffocating presence that wouldn't let me escape. The reality of what had just happened, of what we had just done, was starting to sink in. I was torn between my loyalty to the group, my career, and my growing feelings for Miho, the person who had been my closest friend for so long. How could I balance it all? That night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my thoughts a jumbled mess. I couldn't stop thinking about the way Miho had kissed me, the way his hands had held me, the way everything had felt so right in that moment. But at the same time, I was terrified of what it meant. I had always prided myself on my control, on being the one who kept everything together. And now, with Miho, I felt like I was losing that control, losing myself. The next few days were a blur. The cameras followed us constantly, and I couldn't shake the feeling of Miho's presence everywhere I went. He was always just a few steps away, his eyes watching me with an intensity that made it impossible to ignore. I tried to focus on the tasks at hand, to throw myself into the rehearsals, the interviews, the endless routines. But no matter what I did, my mind always drifted back to him. And then it happened. We were in the middle of a rehearsal, working through a particularly challenging choreography, when I felt a hand on my back, gently guiding me into position. I didn't need to look to know it was Miho. His touch was unmistakable, even in the chaos of the moment. For a brief second, I closed my eyes, letting the sensation of his hand on me calm the rising storm inside. But then, just as quickly, I pulled away, my heart pounding in my chest. The others were busy with their own parts of the routine, but I couldn't focus. All I could think about was Miho, and the way he seemed to be everywhere in everything I did. After practice, as we were heading back to our rooms, Miho caught up with me. He didn't speak immediately, but I could feel his gaze on me, steady and unwavering. "Jay," he said softly, his voice low, "we can't keep avoiding this." I stopped walking, my mind racing. He was right. I had been avoiding him, avoiding the truth, but I couldn't do it anymore. I couldn't keep pretending that nothing was happening between us, that nothing had changed. "I know," I whispered, feeling the weight of his words settle in my chest. "But I don't know what to do." Miho stepped closer, his hand brushing against mine, and for a moment, everything else faded away. The group, the cameras, the fans, none of it mattered. It was just him and me, standing there, caught in a moment that neither of us could deny. "I don't know what will happen either," he said quietly, "but we need to be honest with ourselves, with each other." I looked into his eyes, searching for something, anything, that could give me the answer I needed. But there was no easy solution, no clear path forward. Only the uncertainty of what we had just begun, and the fear of what it might cost us. "I don't want to lose you," I whispered, the words slipping out before I could stop them. Miho smiled softly, his eyes gentle. "You won't. I won't let you." But even as he said those words, I knew there was no turning back. Whatever we had started, whatever we were feeling, it would change everything. The question was whether we were strong enough to face the consequences.